This is a painting by Flemish artist Quentin Matsys entitled The Money Changer and His Wife from 1514, hanging at the Louvre. It has a moral overtone. The objects depicted remind the viewer to condemn human vice linked to greed at a time when international commerce made Antwerp the economic capital of Europe.
Hello and welcome. My name is Trilce Navarrete, and in this video we will have a look at the role of the government in relation to the work museums do. Why should the government subsidize museums, and how much, may be the question most often posed. In economic theory, government support can be expected whenever there is market failure. That is, when the production or the consumption of the goods are not at an optimal level. You might ask yourself, what is the optimal museum output then? Or what is the optimal consumption of museum services? That is indeed a tricky question because it refers to the merit good characteristics of museums. We find them socially desirable for education, enjoyment and inspiration, and believe there should be enough museums so that enough people get a chance to visit them often. Governments will then collect taxes and reallocate them to cover the cost of museum production, or perhaps to cover a price reduction for the youngsters to attend. Museums also have public good characteristics, that is, they are non-rival in consumption and non-excludable in benefits. Your enjoyment of an exhibit does not take away my enjoyment, and certainly for many exhibitions online, we can all access them at any time from anywhere. What about future generations? They might also want to visit the museum, yet they cannot contribute by paying taxes and cannot voice their preferences by paying an entrance ticket to their favorite museum. That means that present generations will have to bear the cost of preserving museums and their collections for future consumers. The argument of equity of access is very important. Just as we want to ensure future generations can enjoy the wonderful treasures we have inherited from our tangible, intangible, and natural past, we also want to be sure all present generations have access to all collections in all museums. We want to be sure that a diverse representation of our past is collected, conserved, researched, communicated, and exhibited. For that, governments might intervene through the drafting of a diversity policy, allocating grants to increase diversity by acquiring what they consider a diverse collection. Perhaps the most important reason why governments support museums is because of their role to improve well-being. Cultural consumption in general is associated with increased physical and mental satisfaction, with improved quality of life, and with greater happiness. That's right. Museums might bring more benefits to visitors than consumers might imagine or be aware of. Not surprisingly, benefits can reach non-visitors, firms, and society at large. Critics to government subsidy might argue that consumers should be able to make their own informed decisions about what they do with their resources and do not need a paternalistic entity to impose a choice and undermine their sovereignty. However, we know that culture is addictive and that our utility increases when we can understand it, which happens only after we experience it. So it makes sense that governments will want to stimulate consumption at an early age. Such measures are meant to correct the market failure caused by the lack of sufficient information available to the consumer for her to judge the cultural good. So far, we have presented the most important arguments for government support to the arts. However, there are other forms of government intervention besides subsidies to museums and their consumers. Besides direct subsidies, governments can also choose to subsidize museums indirectly by giving a tax break to donating private firms or individuals. Think of all major donors to museums who might have financed capital projects to extend the exhibition grounds, or who might have contributed to the acquisition of a piece, or better yet, who might have made a donation to make digitization of a specific collection possible. Depending on the country, legislation might be in place to have a reduction of the yearly tax required, since part of their income was used for the welfare of society. Another important form of government intervention is that of regulating who is or not a museum. The International Council of Museums is a member-based international organization without legislative power that comes together to support the work of museums. They have issued a definition of museums which governments have adopted for their statistics and allocation of resources. The definition approved in 2007 reads, "A museum is a non-profit institution in the service of society and its development, open to the public, which acquires, conserves, researches, communicates and exhibits the tangible and intangible heritage of humanity and its environment for the purposes of education, study and enjoyment." Governments interpret the definition to best fit their context. For instance, subsidies might be directed only to museums that are open to the public all year around, or upon appointment, for instance due to limited staff or remote location. Governments might also contribute to the selection of cultural capital, favoring acquisition or preservation to those that better reflect national identity. Labor is not a tangible asset as collections or buildings might be, but people working in museums are important carriers of information, since they know all there is to know about the collections they work with. In some countries, museum staff are government officials and the hiring process might be highly bureaucratic, while in other countries, labor might have been separated from the government tasks to increase efficiency. We all know that it is much easier to manage objects than buildings than people. We have just seen various tools government use to stimulate the market and carry out short and long-term policies. So how much should governments spend on museums? Knowing that governments have limited resources and that direct financing is not the only way to support museums, we can safely say that there is no one-size-fits-all when designating government support for museums. In fact, the greatest challenge for governments is ensuring equity in the use of resources. This was the video on policy and museums. Thank you for watching. As you can imagine, understanding the flow of resources and the outcome of policy interventions is quite a fascinating exercise. A list of references relevant to this topic are available at the end of this video.